What's something you were once forbidden to talk about because of an NDA but can finally share now that it's expired or no longer valid? A long time ago, I was hired into a law firm. Very shortly after onboarding, I was called into the partner's office and told they had to let me go. I sort of laughed and said, "What for? I haven't done anything yet." Well, a few years prior, I had quit a particularly crappy job. 2 years after quitting, I was subpoenaed to testify in someone else's suit against this crappy employer. With almost no idea it was going to go this way, I ended up as a primary witness and testified for over 3 hours. I found out later they were hit with a judgment of about $10 million, which I was apparently pretty instrumental in, supposedly. Well, wouldn't you know it, this employer was a client of the law firm. Years after I quit and years after being pulled into someone else's lawsuit, some enterprising compliance attorney called up this client of theirs and mentioned, "Oh, by the way, we hired this person who used to work for you in a completely different department from what you use us for, so you'll never see them, but we thought we should mention it." The version of the conversation I was told was that this compliance attorney was told something to the effect of, "That's nice. If you keep them, we will find a different firm to represent us and our roughly $1 million in billables we send you every year." I was handed a pretty sizable check and told, "You never worked here." Overnight, all mention of me was scrubbed from the firm. There was an NDA, which amounted to, "Please don't talk about this," for a while. I even had a whole conversation with them about how exactly I was going to explain in my now imminent job hunt leaving my previous senior position to go nowhere for no reason. It was a crappy thing to have happen, but at the same time, legitimately from a business perspective, I'm not worth losing $1 million a year over, so I sort of understood, even if it really messed up my life for a little bit. Yikes, I couldn't help but imagine him in like a banana suit, as both the witness in the courtroom and in the meeting at the law firm job, lol. Story 2. Dunkin Donuts aren't made in-house and they have sucked universally ever since. Donuts are kind of preposterously perishable. They're perfectly safe to eat for days. But there's this very fragile way the grease is integrated into the dough that breaks down within about 12 hours of cooking that renders them stale and gives you that waxy feel in your mouth if you eat them. Likewise, the frosting tends to release water quickly too, but anyway, the point is, back in the day, if you came into the store, you were going to get a fresh product as we cook night and day. Now, the central distribution model almost guarantees you're getting a stale or near-stale donut even first thing in the morning. No truck moves as fast as an in-house baker, and it's such a goddamn shame. Shy of using egg protein powder instead of raw eggs for the sake of limiting cross-contamination, they were at one time a completely legit bakery. They weren't doing anything or using anything you wouldn't at home. It was all just bigger, but even the mixer looked like a KitchenAid, just scaled up. They utterly destroyed a brilliant product and now just serve that horrid burnt coffee they've always had as though it were something to be proud of. Story 3. I once went on an audition for what I thought was the game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? When I got there, I was looking around the waiting room and I thought it was peculiar that all of the contestant hopefuls looked very attractive. It got even weirder when we had to fill out an entire booklet about our lives, including neighbors, friends, and family information, as well as an NDA that we couldn't discuss the audition. The screen test was unsettling and they were asking really personal questions. I explained I was religious at the time, so I didn't have anything salacious to expose. They kept trying to direct me to take on some sort of bad girl persona, and it all felt very disorienting. I didn't comply. They later admitted it was really an audition for the first season of a new show called Big Brother. Story 4. A man left a pipe bomb outside a building during the protests in 2020. He had his face hidden and was wearing pretty basic clothes and had gloves on. He was caught shortly after, and everyone was theorizing that they must have used facial recognition to ID him, and then used voter records from the machines that must have taken a picture of his face. What really happened? After placing the bomb, he went over to an ATM and used his debit card. Story 5. In the early 2010s, my job was writing about TV shows for an entertainment website. A lot of the time, I would visit a set and interview people and whatnot. On the day that's relevant here, I was on set for the MTV show Teen Wolf. In addition to interviewing some of the actors, they had me and another writer watch the after show they were making, where the actors discussed the big plot twists. That was how I heard a couple of months before it was public that they were ending off the female lead. Right afterwards, a publicist came by with NDAs. Had I leaked the spoiler, MTV could have sued me for $1 million. Story 6. I worked in the finance department at 777 Partners from 2019 to 2021 in close contact with the CFO. During that time, I became increasingly concerned about the company's financial practices and overall culture. Shortly before I left, an FP&A director joined the firm. In one conversation, he directly asked whether I believed the company operated like a Ponzi scheme. Based on what I had seen, I told them it felt that way. There were numerous shell companies in our company website. There were logos for companies we had in our portfolio that I never interacted with internally. Some entities made no economic sense to me. Most internal staff couldn't explain what value or business function they served. I always suspected staff were hired for roles that were beyond their scope on purpose. I still have the list of the company code cheat sheet. There are 100 plus companies listed in the master records, but the only revenue stream I ever saw was the management fees that portfolio companies paid up to 777. I never felt like 777 were actually managing a portfolio, more like they were just, milking everyone under them. Like seriously, what did 777 even manage? In my mind, what value was 777 providing to those entities? What did 777RE or 777 Equipment Finance even do? No one asked questions. My direct manager couldn't even explain the concept of leverage buyouts and didn't know what AUM was and didn't have an accounting or business degree. We were always strapped for cash. No payments went out without the CFO's approval. I raised concerns about AP, equally specifically that vendor payments were often delayed, some vendors never paid, and that it appeared some vendors were being used to cover personal luxury expenses. One of the vendors literally had the last name of one of the founders. Like, seriously? The AP department didn't even have a phone number you could call. Emails went unanswered all the time. One vendor would email us every single week asking for an update we never provided. Our credit card issuer cut our corporate limit from $1 million to $500,000 due to payment issues, and credit card declines became a regular occurrence. Despite this, that same holiday season, all staff received engraved AirPods Pro sent by both founders. Another red flag was that the company accelerated a full transition from QuickBooks to SAP S/4HANA, LOL. This was a quote-unquote global implementation, and it was rushed to be completed in under 2 years. Most employees weren't properly trained, and the system made it difficult to trace transactions or hold anyone accountable. Nothing ever had a backup. We had all these processes and workflow charts, but no one followed them. After spending $1 million to implement SAP, we were still using QuickBooks to pay specific entities. At the start of the pandemic, everyone was working remotely, but we were brought into the office only when investors were scheduled to visit. It was clearly for optics to give the impression of a fully operational and busy company. The culture also felt unserious at times. I recall seeing a controller playing Farmville on Facebook during a finance meeting. I raised these concerns internally. In response, I was placed on a performance improvement plan, a PIP. I chose to resign, and on my last day, while returning company equipment, I was called quote-unquote unprofessional. I told HR everything during my exit interview. I also asked HR about accountability, like who was actually working, because it seemed to me that everyone was pretending to work, but no one ever really did anything. I further asked HR why my department had no weekly meetings, no touch points, no feedback, no communication, nothing. I hadn't heard from my manager since March 2020, yet her photo was still on the website. I asked HR if she still worked here. I began to think the company was faking employees, as there was a mass list for an IT team I had never even seen or heard from. The only feedback we ever got was in December 2020 when the CFO told us we sucked and needed to fix it because cash flow was a mess and blamed us for it. But it felt like theatrics because we were dealing with a new auditor after the previous one dropped us, and the CFO needed to look like he was cleaning house. So obvious. A coworker once texted me, I still have the screenshots, and told me her supervisor had instructed her to manipulate her work hours into our payroll system and add some more. The CFO and founders were indicted this week by the FBI and the SEC for a $500+ million fraud scheme. Total litigation against 777 surpasses $1 billion currently. Feels good. I want to say, I told you so, but I did. No one believed me. Like, bro, how did no one find it strange that this firm couldn't pay anyone on time, accepted over $1 million in PPP loans, still laid off staff, and then publicly announced the purchase of 66 Boeing jets? 777 couldn't keep a $500,000 credit line with Amex, but somehow had cash for 66 Boeing 737 MAX jets? Make it make sense. I personally never missed a paycheck, but that's part of how these things run. Keep the illusion alive. Keep employees quiet and loyal. Classic playbook. Story 7. I was in a focus group for a lawsuit about whether a restaurant tip worker should get true minimum wage for quote-unquote side duties that didn't directly generate tips. Side duties included things like rolling silverware and napkins, picking up trash, and cleaning bathrooms. Tippable people make a ridiculously low minimum wage because it's assumed their tips will more than make up for it. A research company working for a law office called me and 19 other people in to listen to different legal arguments from lawyers from the restaurant chain owner's side. Most of us thought that side work should be paid at a higher rate, although oddly, an older lady who had worked as a waitress for 20 years voted against it. I saw in the news about 6 months later that the case had been resolved in the tip worker's favor. The same research place called me in about a year later to hear a case about a bank being sued over predatory fees. Unsurprisingly, not one person supported the bank. All of this happened over 10 years ago, so my NDA has since expired. Story 8. I was on an episode of Undercover Boss about 11-ish years ago. The production crew really do try so hard to convince the employees it's a different reality show. Everyone always says it's scripted, but it only sounds like that because they ask you to repeat what you just said so many times that it makes it sound like a bad actor reading a cue card. 100% awesome experience. Wish I could be on the show again. Haha. Story 9. Not so much an NDA, just a pretty please promise you'll never tell. It's getting to be 15 years ago now, so I'm pretty sure no one gives a crap anymore. My town's Centennial was coming up and they were having a, quote, design a Centennial logo contest. One of the Centennial committee members was telling me that there wasn't much interest in the contest and they were just trying to drum up more entries. So I called up a buddy of mine, a professional graphic designer, and told him about it. He said, ooh, easy money, and decided to whip something up. He'd never been to my town, so I spent an afternoon wandering around, texting him photos of local landmarks to give him something to work with, and he came up with a pretty cool logo, and lo and behold, he won. Anyway, they made him and me promise to never reveal that he was a graphic designer who lived on the other side of the country because the Centennial Committee was afraid they'd be accused of bringing in a ringer. Oh, and because I confused people the last time I told this story, a quote-unquote ringer is a professional who enters a contest who wildly outclasses the other competitors in order to create a favorable outcome. They're usually encouraged to enter by the organizers. Story 10. I got let go from a very large tech firm. We were an acquired small company, and I had a legitimate problem with my boss. He started to get on my case because I called him out for not being able to do basic things in our software, told his boss that I liked him but just needed him to learn it. 2 months later, I was offered a severance package of 4 months and an 18-month NDA. My manager was friends with the CEO that quit after the sale. I knew this but didn't know the secret. Turns out he wrote his friend into an unfirable job for life. I didn't know this until someone told me 10 years later. Also, we believe he isn't aware he's protected, just a golden ticket through life. And he's still there, and he's a weird one. He ended up marrying his childhood babysitter. Story 11. Apple was developing an electric car in the mid-2010s. I work for an auto supplier and signed quite a few NDAs as part of my job. Most of them are pretty standard stuff. Company A and Company B agree to share confidential info regarding products X, Y, and Z, and will not share any of the info with outside parties, blah, blah, blah. Individual employees don't have to sign them as long as there's one on file between the two companies. The only one that really stood out was the Apple one. They were looking to source components from us, and I was involved in the acquisition on my side. I wasn't allowed to know anything about the project without signing the NDA personally, and once I signed it, I wasn't allowed to say literally anything about the project or the customer to anyone who hadn't also signed the NDA. I wasn't allowed to tell my boss who the customer I was spending most of my time working with was. It was a crazy level of secrecy. Story 12. Not me, but happened to my mom when I was a teenager. One morning, the police showed up at our house with a tow truck and tried to repossess the family vehicle. Funny thing is, the car was actually fully paid off. My mom even presented the title to the sheriff's deputy who was present. The bank insisted she defaulted, and the only way they would agree to not tow the vehicle was if she paid a lump sum of money. I'm not sure how much, but I remember my mom calling around the family to borrow the money. My great-grandmother ended up loaning the cash. My mom hired a lawyer and sued the bank, 717 Credit Union. They settled out of court for enough money. My mom got a new car. Story 13. In 2004, as a lawyer, I traveled to a small island nation, Nauru, for the express purpose of retrieving a nearly complete copy of a film from a former partner of a Scandinavian client under the terms of an NDA that expired last year. The Scandinavian partnership had invested in the production of a film. The partnership dissolved years later, and a major asset of the partnership was held by the former partner who had years ago moved to Nauru. He was staying in Nauru and Australia and had a copy of the film. The film was The Day the Clown Cried by Jerry Lewis. While I was there, I was mistaken for an Australian government official and driven to what was then a largely secret rendition facility for enemy combatants in the global war on terror, operated by the Australian government. Once the mistake was sorted, which involved some threatening language that I was not to reveal what I knew, I was released. Then, while staying in Nauru, I met some clearly Russian gentlemen who were Russian computer experts who were obviously up to no good. I think it was operating a money laundering operation, and that provided an interesting but tense moment. Then I met the Scandinavian ex-partner who eventually agreed to turn the film over to me, which I had to box and return home. I may be one of the few people in the world at that time to see the insanely cringy Jerry Lewis film about which there is now a documentary. I'm working on a book about this. Story 14. I worked for a third-party company that the government had contracted out the calls where you replace your SNAP EBT card. Our company did not do background checks. There was also no security measures in place to get into the building. The system that we used gave us unlimited access to about 40 of the 50 states' entire list of food benefits clients. The information that we had access to include things such as name, date of birth, current address, and social security number. There were several times where employees used this information to stalk an ex or worse. As far as I can tell, there was no record of who a certain person had looked up to, and even though we were assigned specific states, you could look up anyone in any state that we had with nothing more than their first and last name. My password protecting all of this very valuable information for 3 years was password 1. Story 15. Polygraphs are known and understood to be unreliable. I worked in and around the intelligence community in the late 2000s. Intelligence agencies funded a lot of research into interview and interrogation methodologies. Any federally funded polygraph study that produces damning results gets classified. The NDA that I signed expired a year after termination, never held a clearance. Studies detailing the failures of polygraph methods exist and are tightly guarded secrets. Story 16. Demanding proof of a debt from collections will usually buy you a decent amount of time, but your best bet is always going to be to retain an attorney and get them to file a motion to dismiss. Collections lawyers hate having to churn through that stuff. Also, try to get them to do it on Fridays. Crap gets missed over the weekend and can again buy more time. Granted, most people facing collections often can't afford lawyers in the first place, which is why it's such a lucrative business. Story 17. A major manufacturing company runs its multinational factory control systems on pirated and unpatched Windows XP. With software written in pirated IDEs, the engineering staff are instructed to use key generators or replace binaries with cracked versions. They even wrote their own applications to perpetually reset trial software. They also use the data from their security badge system to track line operators and place vending machines, and propaganda posters that would encourage operators to purchase food from the company store versus leaving the factory for lunch. They also overlapped lunch breaks so that the cafeteria would overcrowd, leading the operators to end their lunch and return to work early. This was in multiple countries, but also in the US. These aren't even the most egregious things, just the things I can say and maintain anonymity. Story 18. Summer 2021, I witnessed a lady pass out at a large well-known theme park because all the water fountains were off due to COVID concerns, and the only way to get water was to wait in line outside restaurants. The parks were woefully understaffed, and the wait for water was well over an hour with temperatures in the 90s. She passed out, fell on her face, and when her boyfriend scooped her up, her nose had completely flattened. She was in utter shock. I stayed with them until the medics came. I had to fill out an accident report as a witness and wrote, "The side of her face without her nose will haunt me all my days." The next afternoon, I got an email asking me if I'd signed an NDA to never mention it on my social media channels. In exchange, they would refund my family of 5 season passes, upgrade our season passes to include never having to wait in line for any ride, and give us unlimited free food, snacks, and drinks for the rest of the year, plus some guest passes. I said yes. A week later, water bottle refill stations were installed and restaurants had big containers of water out on the counter. We went to the park almost every day that summer, and I took meals to go for dinner. I ate an ungodly amount of soft pretzels. I do hope the lady is fully recovered and got an incredible settlement package. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 19. We created an algorithm to decide the best order for merchants on a comparison site based on a bunch of factors, which we then outsourced to other websites. Turns out, even when accounting for the user/site, most of the orders should be the same for best performance. But since we outsource to hundreds of affiliates, we basically just add a bunch of randomness in so that each affiliate gets slightly different results. The only people who care are the people running their websites who look at competitors, though, so we actually detect if they are someone who works for those companies and show them the randomized results, and real users see pretty close to the same on any site. Basically, we lie to our customers because they think they need to be different, but we don't like their customers because it's actually better performing. The things that impact it are time of day, geo, etc., so you would see the same result on all 100 sites using our algorithm. The number of people who care about this is close to 0. Story 20. I worked in a bank that had an error that cost the bank lots and lots of money because they made mistakes calculating mortgage payments and predicting balances. The mistake happened in 2005 and wasn't spotted until after the financial crash of 2009, sometimes in 2011. It was caused by someone assuming every month has 28 days on a calculator spreadsheet. The longer it wasn't discovered, the worse the position came. Story 21. The company doesn't exist now, so I can share this, but I am about 95% certain that my former boss is a scam artist. After he ran the company into the ground, I learned he has a history of coming to struggling startups as a CEO and then leaving the companies in worse shape than he found them. But that is insider knowledge you have to dig for. If you just go by LinkedIn, he seems super accomplished. He is one of those people who seems really knowledgeable on the surface, but over time I came to realize he is good with words but didn't understand tech or business. It was like he was cosplaying as a CEO. He also lied constantly, but he was an exceptional gaslighter who really made you question reality. Amazingly, he managed to thwart 3 different coups, one of which was led by the company accountant, who said his numbers were iffy at best and implied money was being mishandled or just straight up missing. Yet somehow he convinced the founders to fire the accountant rather than investigate. Towards the end, he cut all of our salaries by 20% and put us on 4-day weeks, but also gave himself a 20% raise. A month later, he laid off everyone except the CTO and 2 customer service people, made some weird investment with company money into a company owned by his sister and his former roommate, and then quit outright one random afternoon. No notice, just an email saying he was resigning. No idea what he's up to now, but I do fully expect a Netflix documentary on this guy one day. Story 22. I have reviewed multiple pieces of software that purport to replace human interaction for my primary job duty. All of those claim to use trained AI to read and interpret documents, and all of them made me sign an NDA before previewing their software. In violation of those NDAs, I now tell you all, none of them worked as well as an entry-level human with a week of training. They all produced something in the sense that I got dozens of pages of analysis, but it was all the kind of BS filler that large language models produce without anything that substantially aided my job, let alone had the capability to replace me. Story 23. The DoD and CIA use military satellites to image other countries, even ones not in any form of hostilities, then digitize it into maps. I don't mean throwing the pictures in a tile and saving it either. These are highly detailed maps contracted out to mapping companies and partially done/SOPs created by the CIA's geography and foreign intelligence divisions. It wasn't directly written out anywhere, but the implication I got from the guides and contract info the company I worked for got, they do this a lot for different countries, though maybe not all. For sure, all of the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Central/South America. We had to model every single thing from the width of roads at any given point as precise as we could, any streams or water bodies, and if we could tell or estimate if they were seasonal, goat pens, apartments, homes, factories, etc. And we were getting as much info as possible from the imagery. It wasn't just oil refinery you had to work out if it was a lube plant or topping refinery and how many cracking towers they had, etc. There was a guide with tons and tons of equipment from every type of industry you could imagine in case you could identify something like the pump at a water plant being a Milam X1000 model or stuff like that. Every fence between pastures, every power line or little telephone junction box. These absolutely were intended for the DoD for military intelligence or use in case of invasions. The width of a HMMWV Humvee was the distance we used to classify roads one way or another, and any places/crossings more narrow than that had to be marked. Any potential military installations or any sign of military personnel or arms production was of special interest, and how detailed the modeling and info needed to be. My impression from the SOP and fields in the database we didn't use was that once it was digitized, another team somewhere would go through and try to match addresses, people, companies into it all, so it's not just a house but 123 Street owned by John Smith. I worked in Azerbaijan and El Salvador personally, and my clearance has expired, and so has the NDA. The DoD posted the contract for that round of images for those 2 countries. The mapping company I worked for bid but lost a contract was awarded to a law firm in New Jersey with 3 employees for $40 million. They then subcontracted it to our company for $12 million, and the law firm was never involved in any way with the work. Might as well point out some corruption along with the espionage, lol. Story 24. I worked in manufacturing for a very well-known brand that makes bath bombs, claims they're 100% against animal testing, and it starts with an L. If they can't source a raw material that is cruelty/animal testing free, they just use whatever they can find, even if it's from a company that's well known for animal testing and cruelty. It happened all the time. They spent tens of thousands of dollars on staff parties but made sure all the food they served was meat and animal products. They did give free coffee to all the staff at work but stocked the fridges with dairy from a local farm that was well known for mistreating their animals. They also didn't give sick pay and made a lady work through a stroke once. They treat their employees like crap and are not who they claim to be. Disclaimer, this is just their North American branch. I can't speak for the original UK branch. Story 25. I worked on lighting for Kevin Hart's wedding. They wouldn't tell us where the job address was until we signed the NDA. I assume it was to prevent me from selling the info to TMZ. It seemed like a very cool event. The property had 3 full houses, a pool, tennis courts, water features, and beautiful landscaping. The ceremony was on the lawn, reception on the tennis courts, and the after party was on the other lawn. They had a whole arcade and carnival setup with themed game booths and a human claw machine. Like, there was a harness attached to a chain winch that would swing you over a pit of stuffed animals for you to try and grab. It seemed like a lot of fun. There were probably more and better info about the wedding you could get from the web now, but the week before the event, everything was very hush-hush. Story 26. My grandfather was always pretty evasive about his work. As a kid, I just took what he said at face value and thought he worked a boring desk job at an office. I found out after he passed away when I was cleaning out some of his old papers that he was actually a physicist working on some really interesting government projects, including developing sonar guidance for torpedoes and working on the special heat-resistant paint used by the space shuttle. Mad respect, Grandpa. Story 27. I used to work at a global company specializing in automotive spare parts. It is such a lucrative business, no matter how they want to consider themselves as compliant. All global senior executives are in the payroll of local distributors. I'm talking about a German manufacturer, by the way, who claims to be the shining beacon in the business, but everybody knows how they operate. If you dare to raise your suspicions and, be the voice of reason, they treat you like how dare you and find a way to get rid of you. It's unbelievably common. The entire business chain reeks of corruption. Story 28. I signed an NDA, which has since expired, with my best friend. We went to the bank, had it notarized and everything. All the NDA said was that I couldn't talk about his balls or the content of the NDA without his written consent. We did this specifically so we could tell people we signed an NDA. The thought process was you can sign one NDA and it immediately gives you the ability to say, sorry, I signed an NDA, in response to literally anything without lying, so long as you never mentioned what the NDA was about, which would have been a breach of the NDA and therefore not mentionable. Me and him both use the same line, sorry, I signed an NDA, to answer questions we just don't want to answer, or just to be, crabheads. Story 29. I'm going to be vague here even though this is kind of old news now, but if you didn't already know this, banks and other financial institutions outright sell your spending information to Amazon. Your entire savings, checking, and credit card statements get emailed to Amazon every day. Stumbled across the emails about 10 years ago as a new hire just trying to help out. I outright asked why so much info is going out to someone with an Amazon email. I wasn't trying to whistleblow. I am just good with spreadsheets and analytics and wanted to help make it more convenient than hundreds of pages of raw data a day. I thought it might help my career. Instead, I got to meet our security guards. Story 30. Not me, but a patient I was taking care of at the VA in Las Vegas years ago. He was suffering from a rare cancer and said that since he was passing away and they'd ended him, he was accidentally exposed to a radioactive substance on the job. He didn't give a crap about the NDA he'd signed because they can't end me twice. He worked at Area 51 and said the base has nothing to do with aliens. It's because they're doing things there specifically prohibited by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty we signed with a bunch of other countries, and it would have serious repercussions if that was discovered, so the government is more than happy to play up the whole "it's aliens" thing. That's why they'll end your butt without warning if you manage to get past those markers. They can't let that get out because it's far more dangerous than you discovering aliens. Story 31. The oil trade is corrupt to the core. The refineries will scam the oil sellers, and the oil sellers will scam the customers. This leads to the practice where the engineers on board the ships will falsify the record, so they have a small pocket that will help to reduce the loss from sellers, but if the pocket gets big enough, they'll sell the pocket and scam the company. It reached the point where it's almost mandatory to hire a third party to witness the process and minimize losses, in theory, since half of them get paid to ignore any issues and verify that everything is done by the book. Story 32. A good friend of mine got a job working at a subcontractor of Lockheed Martin right out of college. He absolutely hated it but didn't want to pay back the signing bonus, so stuck it out for a couple of years. Turns out he was hired to maintain a software component for a flight simulator, but turns out it was just a Visual Basic front end on top of an Access database. Users selected parameters for the simulation and it spit out a config file that was then imported by the flight simulator. The app itself was garbage, no documentation, poorly structured, etc. He was the only person in the company working on this project, and at some point he learned that they were charging $3 million a year for him to sit around and 5 to 6 times a year add a new configuration. He wasn't allowed to make any other changes as that would trigger a new certification process. Story 33. In early 2014, Disney was developing a competitor to Hearthstone for iOS and Android using Marvel characters, trying to release it before Hearthstone would exit beta and release on mobile devices. It was basically a one-to-one copy/reskin, except it was full of gacha mechanics, but the worst offender was that you could level up your hero, increasing their hit points, giving you an advantage over lower-level players. When they failed to release before Hearthstone, the project was shelved. Later that year, the whole studio was shut down. I was a Q&A tester there. Story 34. I once dropped dirty silverware on Clint Eastwood at the Bohemian Grove during breakfast service. My very first job ever was as a busser at the dining circle in the Bohemian Grove. The dining circle is a big outdoor eating area filled with probably 100 or more picnic benches with the ground covered deeply with wood chips. One morning, while cleaning dirty dishes off the bench next to him, I stumbled on some chips that got piled up and very nearly dropped the entire bin of plates and glasses, but recovered enough that only a fork and knife slid off and landed in Clint Eastwood's lap. I was mortified and was sure I was going to get fired and started stammering an apology, but he waved it off and said, "Don't worry about it, kid. I trip on these freaking wood chips all the time." Story 35. I don't want to badmouth the company because I still kind of like them, but customer support went into the toilet there, not just because branding and etc. Had no idea what they were doing, but also because enough people were taking advantage of their policies being generous. One time, for example, a guy had a product for about 4 years and was a product that isn't stationary. You take it outside, you use it in places where atmosphere and other conditions are a factor, and it can wear out. They had a very generous setup where upgrades and replacements were available nearly for lifetime at a discount. That wasn't good enough for this guy. He spent over an hour telling me how much I sucked, how much our policy sucked, how much I was disappointing him despite being sympathetic because I wouldn't solve it for free. I even went and got him it for free after I literally just took mistreatment from him, and you know what? Dude still escalated because he didn't want to pay the minuscule amount of shipping to get him a brand new product. He ended up escalating and getting it for free, completely. Customers like that were kind of common, just complete schmucks who took it out on you when they had to do a slight hurdle. It was bad enough that they ended up outsourcing the whole department to another country, and then I spent 3 months waiting to see if today was going to be the day when I was going to be cut at my job every single day, worrying, trying to beg my way up out of the department because my mom had worked there and I just had legitimately a good opinion of it because they had treated her really well when I was a kid and it was a fun place to be as a kid. Afterwards, and the stress of that horrible situation, I decided that I was done with support and moved into sales within the same industry at a small company. And to tell you how much I'll stick into a situation like that, I stuck in there for 4+ years until the pandemic hit. And I was trying to sell to my mom and pops who were literally losing their livelihoods and telling me all the sad stories about losing everything with all the insanity of the times. I swore off selling after that too. Story 36. Around 20 years ago, Nvidia had a big reliability problem on some of its parts referred to as bump cracking. Their party line was that it was due to an unforeseeable issue and not their fault. There were many returns, recalls, and threats of lawsuits. Big customers such as HP and Dell were affected. Apple TV devices were too, as well as multiple companies that made PC motherboards. In reality, it was very predictable to anyone with the slightest knowledge of the technology. Dell even brought in consultants from IBM who invented the tech, who provided a clear, simple analysis showing that Nvidia screwed the pooch by violating one of the best-known rules about applying the technology. I don't know how much this issue cost them, but it was almost certainly in the hundreds of millions. To this day, I don't know if people within the company actually believe that they hadn't massively screwed up or if they were just playing dumb. I suspect that there were some of both. Story 37. A tech-savvy dude bought a piece of automation hardware from us and decided he wanted to play rough. Took him about 30 minutes to find out all the usernames and passwords the system used to connect and automate stuff was literally saved in a basic text file. Tech support came to find me. I said, "There's no way." Then he showed me and I reproduced it in-house and we promptly called the Korean dev team over to explain what the hell that's about. I think we sent him a few free devices to keep his mouth shut and encrypted the file going forward. Just like, wow. Story 38. I had to sign an NDA to be in a focus group for the technology that would become known as streaming music services. I sat in front of a desktop computer, chose a type of music, listened to some songs, and an ad played. It was a 50s style jingle with a very perky sounding female singer. She chimed the name of a certain old-fashioned cigarette company, followed by a little ditty. I was shocked and said they couldn't have ads for cigarettes. They were like, "Why not? Because children might be listening?" I thought it was Big Tobacco's way of trying to weasel their way back into the mainstream ad market since they had been banned from TV, magazines, and radio, but this was a new form of media. They were testing the waters. I always wondered if the focus group was about the product or to get people's reaction to hearing a cigarette ad on it. Story 39. My old company was knowingly buying faulty equipment, installing it in people's homes, and putting people's lives and properties at high risk. They were responsible for at least one apartment fire, a multiple unit flooding that could have been prevented if the sensor worked, and the SA/assault of a young woman due to a faulty lock. I'm glad they eventually messed with the wrong company and ended up being sued after a thorough investigation. Story 40. Oh hell yeah, my time to shine. I worked for Vice, and the way they paid us was 100% illegal. They'd ask for a day rate, then lowball us and offer like $50 to $100 less. Then, when we had to fill out our time cards, they requested that we fill it out for the full 12-hour day. You get paid OT after 8 hours, so that they technically, on paper, look like they were paying out OT. Anyways, once you break the checks down, you'd see that they made it so they were technically underpaying us per hour, but because of the OT, it evened out. Once I found this out, I tried asking for a raise without telling them why and why they refused. I was only asking for another $50 a day. After they said no, they immediately asked me to sign off on them paying $3,000 for a stock photo and an edit they never used. So yeah, I didn't resign my contract and Vice can go screw themselves. Story 41. I complained about being bullied to the HR department and they threatened me with legal action unless I sign an NDA. I left the organization and then received a further letter reminding me of the NDA and that I would be pursued for legal damages if I mentioned what the problem was. I took advice and was advised that if I couldn't afford the legal cost that I should just let it go. The cost of justice was not something I could afford. Story 42. I was part of the pilot program at Walgreens with Theranos, along with other pilot programs for the company. It was a crap show from the beginning. The pharmacist kept asking questions about how it worked, and we were given the stupidest responses. We weren't allowed to provide negative or constructive feedback. We could only give positive feedback about what worked. We weren't allowed to substitute any materials or supplies. We could only use what was provided by Theranos. I never got far enough to use. We just set it up, got training, got materials, and they kept pushing it back. Story 43. It's not an NDA situation, but my friend worked for an academic professor, and during her time in that job, she was overwhelmed because it was incredibly busy and unsupported, and she basically developed a nervous breakdown. She was meant to collect raw data from patients who had a particular medical problem and pass it to the professor, who was widely known to shirk his clinical studies and supervision of junior staff, and instead concentrate his time on publishing articles under his name. Anyway, she had to get piles of his data paperwork in, hadn't done it, and she just filled in all the questionnaires herself, made up the answers. He publishes in medical journals based on that data. It's all a crock. Story 44. I worked at a dry cleaners as a 16-year-old. They hired a new coworker I was training. We closed one night, and the next morning I arrived to work and the police were there. The new coworker stole over $700 in cash from the drawer. Turns out he was a felon on a release program and the dry cleaner never told me. Since I was a minor, it was a huge issue. Anyways, I got a settlement. I had an NDA, but that dry cleaner has been bankrupted for over a decade. And if any of these stories got to you too, here's more for you. YouTube thinks we're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.